energizes creative possibilities. The fact that you as a creative being, not just you as a creative being, but you can explore creativity. You can explore certain frozen areas, maybe of expression, frozen areas of languages within you, and you can create loops of energy. So it also works as a kind of cultural ecology, and so unleashing energy. So then I think that is a very important aspect of translation today. And of course, there is the virtual world where you're constantly translating. You're translating not just languages, but you're, mentally, but you're also translating maybe emojis, you're translating pictures, you're translating. So it's also what is called intersemiotic translation, translating from one sign to the other. And of course, interlingual translation as well. Am I audible? Am I speaking fast? Is it all right? Or should I speak slowly?
It's all right, madam. It's fine. It's fine.
Fine? Okay.
Yes. Clearly audible. No issue.
Clearly audible. Okay, thanks. One thing before I really, before I move forward, and that is, I was just talking about the virtual world, and I think the virtual world has also increased a certain tendency in the world which was there, not just a tendency, but a reality, and that was a one-way traffic. A one-way traffic in the sense that there was always a translation from, into English, so from other languages. So we're all, going in one direction, and you know that one-way traffics are never healthy. So you need to have traffic in all directions. And I think it is important for all of you, it is important for all of us who are in translation studies to prevent this one-way traffic and to see how we can enable translation, how we can enable translation to move out in different directions. And of course, so to translate from as many languages into as many less translated languages as well, to translate from as many less translated languages into as many less translated languages as possible. So with those words, I think I will move towards my presentation, and I will try to share PowerPoint, share a screen. Just a minute. Sorry. Yes. This is, I'm going to talk about aspects of translation studies. Am I audible? Hello? Hello?
Yes, ma'am, you are audible. You are audible. Please go ahead.
Okay, fine.
Something is going wrong with my while I mute myself, and while unmuting it's going wrong. So you go on, madam. It's fine.
It's fine. Okay, you can also see my screen. Can you see my screen?
No, madam.
Yes, Subha. Yes.
Huh?
Yes.
You can see my screen, Jatin?
Yes, of course. I can.
Oh, okay. Okay.
No, ma'am, we can see you, but not the screen.
Not the screen.
Okay, sorry. So just, should I try again? Just let me try. This is, I think it's important that you see the screen as well.
Okay, the screen we can't see. But,
okay, so I will just try. Just bear with me a moment. I will just try again. Okay, so let me try to share screen. Sorry, just a minute. I can't see the share screen button. Sorry, where is the share screen button? Can someone help, please?
Madam, there's a present now at the bottom there.
Yeah, there. Yeah, sorry, yes.
Click on that, madam.
Yes,
And
your
then,
entire screen.
yeah, your entire screen, yes.
Yes. Okay, can you see now?
Uh,
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet. Yeah, sorry, just bear with me a little. Can you see? No.
No. Now we'll probably be able to see, yes.
Yeah.
It's visible now, ma'am.
Yes, it's visible, but it hasn't yet come, right?
And no, it hasn't. Yes, it's visible now.
It's visible now?
Yes, madam.
Okay. So, so we have these aspects of translation studies, process-oriented. I mean, we are trying to talk about translation studies and trying to see how the factors involved in translation studies. And so I think this is a somewhat arbitrary division, but nevertheless, it helps in approaching translation studies to an extent. So you have this process-oriented, product-oriented, and function-oriented. And I will move towards the function-oriented first because that relates to cultural studies, and that also relates to certain issues, and perhaps I'm also more involved in this part of translation studies than in those other two parts. Although I think that the function oriented is also linked with the product oriented. So actually function oriented relates to translation history, which means which books were translated, where, by whom, how, and also the influence that the translated books had on the cultural scenario of the target culture. So this is this is what I'm trying to this will be the first part of my talk, and here I'm trying to show you that there are certain received notions with reference to the history of translation. And somehow sometimes these we have to go beyond these received notions. And if we really go deep into the history of translation, we see that sometimes received assumptions need to be questioned. So, several translation scholars feel that the early period, in the early period, we did not have translation. Translation as we know it today came to us after the emergence of print. So it was with print culture that we had translation. There are other scholars who think otherwise. And so they feel that, they feel that the medieval period, for instance, was a golden age of translation. And translations opened up a certain space for dialogue between the authoritative tradition of Sanskrit, linked with Brahminical power and hierarchy, and the people. But also, this was also during the 17th and 18th centuries, there were translations and retellings of Arabic, Persian, and Hindi narratives, along with Sanskrit texts, as a part of religious encounters taking place between communities during the period. And it has been demonstrated by scholars, by Tony K. Stewart, who works in this area, that this search for equivalence in the encounter of religions, where each tries to make oneself understood in a language not one's own, may be comprehended through translation models that are at the same time literal, refractive, dynamic, and metaphoric. And what is more important is that lead to complex realms of conceptual sharing. So actually, a study of translations during this period would lead us to see how one enters these realms of conceptual sharing. And then the third factor in this, in the of translation history in the early period, is that translation during that period played an important role in the formation of a public culture that had multiple interwoven strands of folk and religious cults. So that is what our public culture is made of. Multiple interwoven strands of folk and religious cults, along with different kinds of storytelling and performative patterns. So these, I would say, these fall within the realm of translation studies. And then we have not really, we have a few scholars who have looked at the whole of translational history in India, but we have a few, and we have, for instance, Prabal Dasgupta, who he is not just talking about the Indian context, but it is applicable to the Indian context, is that one encounters a kind of missionary paradigm in the early phase of translational history. Missionary does not here mean just religion, but missionary means also knowledge that is, knowledge that one feels one needs to acquire, knowledge that is sometimes also imposed, but also, there is a restrictive category. There's a restrictive field of choice from which one takes, and one takes in accordance with one's needs and immediate needs. It's a constructivist paradigm, he calls it, and there one gradually moves on to a substantivist paradigm, which is where one is, one has a broader choice. One can choose from the, one links translational practices with the material conditions of life, and and one moves forward. But what I feel is that there are multiple ways in reading this history, and this history can also yield multiple meanings. And I will just touch upon one small note one particular line in this translation history, and that is the fact that in our translation history, we have again and again a kind of a reinstatement of a plurilingual world, of a multilingual culture. And this is evidenced right from the very first, very second text that was translated after the appearance of print. And these were 3 legal regulations. And it must be mentioned that the plurilingual situation in India led to a kind of multilingual court vocabulary. This was there in the first 3 legal regulations too. There were a mix of different words from different languages. And so with a large amount of code switching, and the tradition has continued in translation of legal documents to this day. So, then moving on, we see that translation, this multilingual, multicultural element within translation was evident all through. And so it had multiple overlaps, indicative of a robust energy. There was a strong assimilative impulse, and names of texts were often interchanged. For instance, Hitopadesh was translated several times in the early period, and then Hitopadesh, a text in Sanskrit, was translated into Bangla. There were 3 different translations in the course of about 6 years. But Hitopadesh was also the name of a collection of translation of Aesop's tales brought out by the School Book Society. So, this is, there was no hesitation in having the same name for a book, for a collection of translation of tales from a very different culture. And then we've always had this in our system, that a translator often translates core cultural texts from two different cultures, demonstrating an easy journey between cultures. For example, we have Tarashankar Karkaratna, who translated Banabhatta's prose romance Kadambari and Samuel Johnson's Rasselas. Both are important texts in their own cultural traditions. And Tarashankar does not have, he's equally at home in both. So he's affiliated, as it were, to both cultures, or there is as I said, there's an easy journey between cultures. And also, if you look at the history of translation, particular, often we see that both Meghadutam and Rubaiyat are two of the most translated texts in Bangla. And with that, I think, yes, and also before moving out of this phase, I would like to state that often, as I said before, that often if you look at translation history, it leads to the questioning of assumed norms. For instance, there was this vernacular literature committee established by British and Indian scholars, which was actually a society for the translation of text in Bengal. And in the preface to the first text published by this society, which was called Lord Clive, the translator wrote that the object of the association is distinctly stated to be not only to translate, but to adapt English authors into Bengali. Sorry. The colonialist project aimed at obliterating elements in the literary system. Sorry. And that was only partially successful because the society produced texts from many languages and not only from English. So I think I will move on. There are also, you see that it leads to overt changes in knowledge systems. If you read, I saw a work being undertaken on the medical literature related to madness. And like Foucault's Madness and Civilization, we also see there how, madness receives a very rigid form. How madness is, how what is normal receives a very, very, very rigid structure. Similarly, certain other issues like, a lot of texts on midwifery were translated, and those obliterate, and those sort of serve to erase certain, the knowledge systems that one had in the country related to midwifery. And so there was here, there was no question of coexistence in these cases. So that is one part. I will now move over to another part, and that is look at the process. Now, I'm not very, but I'm not very comfortable, should I say, with these structures, but they're helpful. Comfortable because I find them a little rigid, but they do take up issues that may be useful, and they also give you an overall picture. Translation, I think, is a more fluid process, but for practitioners and for those who are approaching translation studies, maybe one needs certain tools, and these tools perhaps help. This is, I have actually taken this from a Bengali scholar, but who has again taken this from other sources, but who has sort of transformed them, and I too have transformed some of it, parts of it. So you have the source language and the target language. So you have a text where what matters is the writing and what matters is the style. And the style is that of the authors. And behind the author, you have a history of literature. You have a style of the school to which he belongs. You have his mental makeup, and you have the purpose, his purpose in writing. And similarly, in the target language, you have the writing, but you also have the reading on the part of the translator, and you have the translator's style. There too, you have history of literature, you have the style of the school, and you have various areas of reception. Reception in the context of time, in the context of place, in the context of culture, and in the context of the individual. And also you have a purpose of translation on the translator's part. Then you have on this part of the source language, you have the history of language, you have the style of the genre, you have a worldview, you have literary ideals, all these of the authors of the source, that is of this, the source language text. And whereas in the target language, you again have history of language, you have genre style, you have reception, and you have worldview, and you have the literary ideal of the translator. So, and then you have, to come back to source language, you have structure of language, you have period style, you have social position of the writer, and then here you have the structure of language, you have the period style, you have reception, and then you have the translator's individual preferences. And with relation to genre, I think it should be noted that even within literature, you have different. I mean, there has to be, there are different approaches to the translation of poems, different approaches to the translation of fiction, different approaches of novels and of short stories, and different approaches to the translation of plays. But I'm not entering into that question here. That is also not a part of this issue. These issues related to the process. So the transformation in itself is a complex process, and it has all this behind the very act. I mean, there is this entire process taking place in the very act of translation. And however, this is this was say in the perhaps in the last decades of the 20th century. The framework is still valid today, but there are a few factors that we perhaps need to underline, and that is the complexity of intercultural translation that involves more than the author and the translator. So it is not just a question of the source language author and the target language translator. You have a reader. Of course, reader's role is included in reception, but maybe certain other factors may be there. The intermediaries, maybe the role of intermediaries and events, prizes, etc., editors, publishers, etc. But also the very notion of the text. The notion of the text today has become rather fluid. And within the text, the text itself has this a kind of dialogic intertextuality. I mean, you can only translate because you have that dialogic intertextuality within the text itself. So that changes the fact, certain traditional oppositions or binarisms like fidelity, inaccuracy, source, target, transparency, opacity, etc. And what we have today is gradually a more complex point of view, which is, which evolves, which is gradual and which is nuanced. And one includes today rewriting, recreation, contribution to literature, etc., within legal, social, and historical constraints. And then now I will move on to maybe this is a part of the process, but here one is looking at the kinds of texts and what happens in each case. And the kinds of texts are divided in accordance with language functions. This is taken from, but again, reworked from, partially reproduced from Peter Newmark's approaches to translation. And Newmark is working with Buller's language functions, but actually later, there is this text by Roman Jakobson, who has 6 approaches to an act of communication, or rather 6 elements to an act of communication, and that takes care of several other functions. However, there is no schema which probably, I don't know, maybe there is, but that could have other nuances. However, this again is, as I say, that this is you cannot have the final word in where translation is concerned, and this is also somewhat rigid, but then it gives you an insight into what is happening in the course of translating. So you have examples. So you have the texts are divided into 3 categories. One is expressive, the second is informative, and the third is vocative. Vocative, that is where you're directly addressing the reader, or the reader. So you have, in the expressive, you have literature, you have scientific, and in the informative, you have scientific texts, you have technical texts, and in the vocative, you have notices, you have laws, publicity, maybe you can have advertisements, propaganda literature, all kinds of things. So where you're trying to persuade. So the ideal style, this is in the expressive section, it is the individual. In the informative section, it is neutral and objective. In the vocative section, it is persuasive and imperative. And method, here the method is literal translation. Now, literal translation is translation where you're trying to, where you're actually trying to render as closely as possible as the other language allows the contextual meaning and the experience of the original. So which means that you have to get the meaning and the experience across, you're actually looking at syntax, you're looking at word order, you're looking at rhythm, you're looking at sound. So syntax, word order, rhythm, sound, all these have semantic values. So this is what is meant by literal translation. And in the informative section, you have equivalent effect translation. That is, you're aspiring towards the same effect, equivalent effect translation. And in the vocative context, it's equivalent effect recreation. That is, you can use whatever other means to get the same effect. So in the context of the information, in the context of text, etc., there is this equivalent effect translation, and in the case of notices, laws, etc., it's equivalent effect recreation. And text emphasis in the expressive context is the source language. In the informative context is the target language, and in the vocative context too, it is the target language. The focus in the context of the expressive is figurative. In the case of the informative, it is factual, and in the case of the vocative, it is compelling. Although the unit of translation is word, what I would like to state is also that you're never really focusing on a word. You're actually focusing. You have to focus on the word. I mean, words are important in literature, but eventually it is the general tone that matters in any translation, I think. and also I remember this, because I remember maybe it was Leela Rai, I think, I forgot, who was who was talking to someone about translation. Who she was responding to someone who asked her about something, and she says, "No, never look at dictionaries while translating, because dictionaries will lead you to words which are dead. And while you're translating, you need to work with a living language." Similarly, Rabindranath, I remember, was, has stated at one point that if one fails to translate well, it is because one is afraid of using the colloquial language. So these are some of the factors there. But on the other hand, this unit of translation, I mean, and she's careful to write the minimum unit of translation it would be word, and there. So, and then you have keywords. So for the in expressive literature, you have leitmotifs, stylistic markers, and keywords. This is all right. And then in the informative section, you have theme words. And in the vocative section, you have token words. Token words in the sense that, you may have for advertisements, you may have for the advertisement of cars, etc. I mean, you use whatever word is in fashion at that point of time with the young generation. For the advertisement of, say, for instance, of perfume, maybe you might use a French word. So these are token words. Theme words, for instance, say you're translating a text that relates to globalization, and you have a word called planetarity. So you are not using. So you have to keep on repeating you will use the word planetarity throughout, because that is the theme on which that particular essay is centered. Where leitmotifs, etc., are concerned, I remember this is from the history of Bible translation. I remember that the Bible translation. I mean, it's interesting, Bible translation and what was happening there. That is also something that we need to look at more carefully. And there you find that there you find that certain words, they had a meeting. See, in the early stages of Bible translation, I don't know about the case in Oriya, but I think it will be more or less the same. But in Bengal, in Bangla, what happened was that the translations that were produced right from 1800, even earlier, to till about 1832, in the different editions, there were probably 8 editions. The syntax was absolutely foreign, and one couldn't read it. It used to be very jarring. Now, the prose had not really gained the kind of fluidity that was necessary to translate. And they were using a lot of literal translation. I mean, they were taking recourse to literal translation. And then there was a meeting. I think this meeting was held in the Baptist. There was a meeting in 1865, and there one sees that it is advocated that certain words be retained. And for instance, when they are saying, I'm the Alpha and the Omega. So in Bangla, they are asking you not to translate the words Alpha and Omega. They're saying Ami Alpha or Omega. And then and then again in another context, they're saying that you should retain the word Nabi for prophet, because the Bengali word Bhavishyat Bhakta, or one who can talk about the future, cannot be used because it is not connotative enough. But the word Nabi is connotative. And so use the word for prophet, use the word connotation. Use the word that is more connotative. So these are some of the things that enter that one needs to remember in while translating literature. I would also like to mention this, since I'm talking about the Bible translation, that there were better results in free translations after a certain period, after 1832, maybe, or still later. As there is for instance, there were in a version of a translation of the Psalms, there were a number of Persian words, and that really went well with the readers. And there were when they were translating Solomon's songs into Bangla, there is an 1878 translation where Solomon's songs are rendered in a Panchali form, and that was really effective. So this is again important. So to come back to this, so you have unusual metaphors in the context of literature, you reproduce them. In the context of informative texts, it's enough if you give the sense. And in the context of the vocative, probably one can recreate. I'm not going into this, the fact that, literal translation and how versus other kinds of translations, because translation as this is the one is not really thinking in terms of the exact, reproducing the exact contextual meaning of the original, and that is also not possible. And sometimes technically accurate translations really have nothing to contribute to the literary world. And if they do not have anything to contribute to the literary world, and nobody reads them, then they fail as they fail to communicate. So there has to be a process, a kind of there has to be a new space. This is nothing new. This is something that had been talked about earlier as well. And but there is there are nuanced thoughts related to this new space, and which can be a space also of mutual exchange, and which can lead to the enrichment of both source language and target language texts. And also texts, we talked about the expressive, the informative, and the vocative, but a single text may incorporate these different functions. So the whole context of translations and issues, and they have undergone changes. They have undergone, but sometimes radical changes. But then there are certain, but then again, they are important to sort of to orient translation activity in some certain contexts. So translation, one actually envisions translation today as leading to a growing network within the communication system. And I particularly like this phrasing, that it's a significant set of meanings that refers to another set of meanings through phases of enrichment and progressive development. So a significant set of meanings that refers to another set of meanings through phases of enrichment and progressive development. This can, you can take this statement from various directions. You can think of the translation of a text, say, of a single text diachronically in history, that is through the different periods in history, and how the text gains, or what it loses is also gains in other contexts. So there is this. So you have kind of an enrichment. You have layers added to it, maybe layers also taken out from it. But this is there is a kind of a movement forward, perhaps. this is, and again, you have in the same context, maybe you can think of, um, well, yes, and also you can also think of a translation. We know this, that it leads to the afterlife of a text. Sometimes the afterlife is not happy as well. But the afterlife of a text might mean that it can lead to other kinds of texts. It can lead to other kinds of translations, and so on and so forth. So then I will just end with a few texts on translation, and this is from the modernist period, and the first person I'm taking is Shudhindranath Datta, the eminent poet. And Shudhindranath, poets from the mid-20s of the 20th century tried to come out from the dominant presence of Tagore to find new means of expression as they grappled with the times, the aftermath of the war, the freedom struggle, the economic depression, and the resulting instability. Shudhindranath Datta, in an essay entitled Emancipation of Poetry, emphasized the need for an open-ended process of reception. He stated that the ground for creating poetry was not as fertile as before, and so the poet should go out into the world and gather seeds that could germinate into poetry. Journals of poetry focusing on translation came out in those times, and they changed the scene of modern poetry to a great extent. And I will take up another small comment, because this is something that I really like. And Datta also talked about, he used a complex symbol to describe his status as a translator. Although his translations could never reach the perfection of the source language poem, he felt he could achieve the status of Ekalavya. So he brings in the story of Ekalavya. He thinks of himself, the translator, as Ekalavya. And so it was the colonizer's history that made Datta use the phrase of, as the image of Ekalavya for the translator. And it seemed that there was more pride than humility in this particular image. This is important as we think of the post-colonial context of translation and the things that are usually stated regarding the colonizer's position. I mean, the position of the colonizer, sorry. And then I will move on quickly to Buddhadev Bose, and this will be my last reference. Then he also a poet. Both Buddhadev Bose and Shudhindranath Datta were responsible for bringing in modernism in the context of poetry in Bengal. So speaking on the act of translation with reference to Shudhindranath Datta's translations, Buddhadev Bose stated that translational activity implied training in discipline and self-restraint. It also brought in what he called Atmashuddhi, or purification of the self. In other words, labor undertaken for the sake of poetry in a detached manner as a kind of sadhana or a single-minded austere striving led to purification. This is important because it talks about the rigor of translation, and it talks about how it is, this is, so it's not just a question of, even if one is talking of the fluidity of the text, etc., one cannot really, this is, I mean, that's a different matter altogether. But in order to translate, one has to enter into a state of deep reading. I think Spivak talks about this. She says that, when you are translating, you're entering the kind of deep reading that you would never otherwise have entered into. And also that, this deep reading makes you, makes the text your own. So you have a hold over the you have a you make the text your own so that you can engage with it as you translate. This is important. And to go back to Buddhadev Bose again, with reference to his translation of Kalidas's Meghadutam, he wrote that the ancient literary tradition manifested itself as a vital part of the modern because of an uninterrupted history of translations of ancient texts. So you have tradition as a part of the modern because of the tradition of translations, an uninterrupted history of translations of ancient texts. Translated texts, while being discrete units, were also a part of larger systems contributing to an extent to give shape to contemporary texts and or investing them with a certain depth and perspective. And so with that, this is, I mean, there are several strands. I wanted to weave in strands that are, theoretical with strands that are practical also. But what I wish to state is that eventually the translator in an intercultural context is a mediator whose task is to create an intermediary zone where cultures can communicate, enrich one another, and move forward in the form of a growing network. Thank you very much for your patient hearing. Thank you so much. Yes.
Thank you, Subha ma'am. That was indeed presentations which we learned a lot from, and the very systematic manner you presented it. I would now request Sarbani, who is the research associate of our Center of Excellence, to call for questions if there are any, or just go ahead with the rest.
Okay, ma'am. Good evening, ma'am. And good evening to all of you, to the participants. I would now open the floor for any questions or any comments that you have on Subha ma'am's lecture today. Feel free to post your questions, or you may directly even show yourself on the screen. Let's wait for them to post questions, ma'am.
Yeah, sure,
Till
absolutely.
that, till that time, I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
And at the beginning of the lecture, you said that translation has not gained traction so much in India as it has gained in the rest of the world. So why do you think it's such a case with India? And if possible, if you could suggest some steps that can help improve this condition.
Yeah, no, I was talking in a very traditional fashion, in the sense that, if I ask somebody to translate a text, translators, they would at once come up with the question, and who will publish the translation? So we have not been able to create a market for translations, despite the fact that there is so much need for translations of all kinds of texts. And that, I think, that needs to be addressed from various directions. I mean, centers like yours could really help. I mean, in the sense that publishers need to realize that there is a market, there is a demand for translations, all kinds of translations, and also, so it has. But I think this is it has the situation has improved a great deal, and it looks positive. I mean, it looks as if translation does have a future, and probably a great future. And again, different kinds of translation. Although one is, I was just thinking of text, but maybe one finds, there are possibilities to work in other contexts, where one is translating in different companies and in different sections and different public sector units. So there is this constant demand for translators, interpreters. Interpretation is a part of translation, and so on and so forth.
That seems quite encouraging on your part. That it's growing, the market is growing, but I think we need to try harder. Meanwhile, we have a question from Aditya Nayak, and he says, hello. He asks you, what is the main difficulty of translating a work of high literary merit, and what qualities and skills are expected from a literary translator?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question. Yes, it is. It depends on the kind of text that you are choosing. I mean, whether it's poetry, whether it's fiction, whether it's drama, and each has its. I mean, each has its problems. Each has its issues, and maybe what is the main the what is the main difficulty? The main difficulty is perhaps is getting the right tone, getting the that will bring about the a similar experience that you had while reading the original, possibly. And high literary merit, what qualities and skills? Yes, I think a desire, a passion, a desire to translate, a passion to translate. I think that's because that also brings in a lot of rigor. That also brings in, you go on attempting, you go on trying to translate. I remember this is Buddhadev Bose. He translated Baudelaire's Le Fleur du Mal, and there were a lot of, and well, the people said, well, it's not. I mean, it does not. I mean, well, there was it's not Baudelaire really, because the language was not really ready at that point of time to encompass the language of Baudelaire. I mean, Bangla at that point of time was not at a stage where it could encompass the whole gamut of experiences that Baudelaire was trying to bring to poetry. So it has a kind of romantic structure. But there is a modern poet recently, a very important modern poet, Joy Goswami. Recently, he talked about the fact that it was Buddhadev Bose's life as translator that he was looking up to, and the fact that he translated all those poems, and probably he did not get the right word, but he would wait and wait and wait, and all of a sudden, perhaps he would, after many days, probably he would all of a sudden get a certain word. So it was to keep hoping, to keeping oneself open, and and also constantly being at it. I mean, this kind of dedication is, he said, was what made Buddhadev Bose's translation of Le Fleur du Mal one of the greatest texts of translation in Bangla. I'm not sure if I've answered your question really.
I hope,
But
Aditya,
anyway,
that answers your question. I seriously felt it did. He combines rigor and discipline, as you said, Buddhadev Bose. And I could feel as if it links it with a higher level of spirituality, which can be gained because you keep on waiting to receive the correct word, and you do not actually know when it will come to you. It's almost as doing something which is first hand. It's as good as a creative
yeah,
exercise, no? Which you're
yeah,
doing,
definitely.
uh, for primarily as it's as important as writing a primary text. We have, ma'am, another question from Saswat Ponda, and he thanks you for the engaging talk. And he also asks you, could you please elaborate on the breakthrough made by print in the field of translation? Was it only in terms of the number of texts that got translated, especially because of technology that favored large scale production of text?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. Also, I thank Aditya for that, for your very interesting question, important question. And yes, this is, I think, no, the print, I think, brought I mean, changed the field of translation to a great extent. Translation became more institutionalized. after the advent of print. So there was these societies were set up, and so this is, and this whole question of uh, the literal translation, the whole question of translating. I mean, the field also perhaps became slightly became narrower, because you were not translating. You were not translating um, different kinds of texts. You were translating. It was again, quote unquote, the missionary kind of zeal. Missionary, I'm not referring to religion, but I'm referring to certain kinds of knowledge. Encyclopedias have to be translated. Knowledge texts like physics, chemistry, geography, and institutionalizing language, institutionalizing, um, bringing in symmetries, bringing in all kinds of so there were, I mean, one has to really explore this in greater detail, but I think it was not simply a question of the number of texts. The number of texts did multiply, but they also, I mean, an institutionalization means a lot of things. Power structures come into the play. I mean, come more. I'm not saying that otherwise they're not there, but power structures become more defined, and also because you are told what you will translate. And so if a text wins a prize, it gets translated into many other, and so on and so forth. So there are hierarchies are established. So so there may be other positive areas also as far as institutionalization is concerned, but there are these other factors too. Yes, thank you. Thank you for that question.
That was a good question. I think I have another one from Shipra Gupta. She thanks you for the lecture and she asks you, would it be proper to have comparative literature as a part of translation studies or vice versa?
Yes, I think translation studies could be a part of comparative literature, but both can exist separately also. But vice versa, no, because comparative literature is not, although Susan Bassett thought at one point of time, but she doesn't think so anymore. I mean, she has talked about this. She says that at one stage she thought that it would be translation studies, because in comparative literature you're doing intercultural studies. But now it is translation studies where you're doing intercultural studies. So comparative literature will be replaced by translation studies. That's not the case, because comparative literature does other things as well. But it does a lot of things that are also, that are very similar to translation studies. But again, there are a few other things. For instance, interdisciplinarity, for instance. I didn't have the occasion to mention that, but interdisciplinarity is becoming more and more a part of translation studies. And interdisciplinary has always been a part of comparative literature. I mean, interdisciplinary in the sense that you have, for instance, you have cultural studies, you have the cognitive sciences, you have anthropology, you have sociology. I mean, translation will work, or translation, they're all working with translation. So, yes, thank you again once more for your question.
That was a nice answer, I guess. I have one more question. Actually, I have a comment and a question. You said that you quoted somebody in between your lecture that never look at dictionaries for translation because these words are dead. What do you exactly mean by that? Because I refer to the dictionary all the time.
Yeah, we all do actually. We all do know. What she meant was that you need, what she meant was that, your intuition. I mean, that's important. Also, because you may find a dictionary, because dictionaries supply you with words that are um, that are in a sense dead, in that sense. So dead and not dead, but then in the sense that what she meant was that you just write what comes to your mind first, and if you are translating, you will see that often you look at dictionaries, you look for words, and then finally when you're trying to revise, find that your original, the first time of what you had thought worked better than the other instances.
I
That is
agree.
also something that I learned in several workshops, that your first attempt is often the best attempt. But of
Best
course,
it
you have to
is.
go back. I mean, to sort of polish it a little, to polish
Thank
it,
you,
work
Subha.
on it again. Yeah.
May,
Hello.
may may I ask a question, please?
Sure, sure. Please, Jitendra.
Thank you,
And I'm sure
Subha,
I want
for that illuminating lecture. We learned so much from it.
to. No,
I
no, thank
would like you to elaborate on that fascinating parallel between Ekalavya and the translator, which Buddhadev both established. So would you
Yeah,
dilute on that? Would you
yeah. That was. Yeah, I find that fascinating too. I mean, he just has a sentence or two. It's actually Shudindranath Datta. It's Shudindranath Datta who talks of the translator as the Ekalavya. That is, Ekalavya, that is, I think what he means is that he says that I will never be able to translate a text. I mean, I will never be able to reach the level of the original text. But then I will keep trying, I will keep practicing, and there will come a time when I will probably exceed the original and I will do better perhaps than my guru. He doesn't say that. Akalavya doesn't say that. But I will excel. Not than, or there's no comparison, but I will excel. And but then this is so that it's I think it's a very potent metaphor. That there is a kind of one is all, because particularly he translated a lot of high modernist poets like Mallarmé, like Rimbaud. No, not Rimbaud, Mallarmé and Valéry. Very difficult poems too. So probably as a as a probably, I mean, not probably, but he's trying to say that even as a person from the colonized world, even if you have reservations about even if you have not reservation, but even if you have doubts about your capacities, capabilities, and you're constantly working, maybe you will reach a stage where you will excel. And but it's a very very potent kind of, not just potent, but it's also a very important metaphor, I think, that he's using. I also feel that people talk about the different words that we have for translation. For instance, anubad, tarjuma, etc., etc., and that we should look at those words and try to see how we are different, how our notion of translation is different from those in the Western world. But I think when we talk of translation, these concepts are all they're all enmeshed together. What's important, what becomes important, I think, are some of the metaphors that are used. I think Ekalavya is one such metaphor, like cannibalization, um, used in the Brazilian context, and then well, many other such in the medieval context. There is there are certain models, maybe not model, but anyway, there may be certain other metaphors too, but that we need to work with in order to think of uh, our approaches to translation. I don't know, Jatin, if I've answered your question, but thank you for asking that question.
He says thank you.
Okay.
No, no,
Yeah,
no.
thank
You
you.
have answered my question to my satisfaction. Thank you for
Thank you so much.
the answer. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for agreeing to give this lecture at our center, and I hope you will remain associated with our center in future. And
Actually, I'm honored to be a part of this, and thank you for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. I love talking about translation, and as you know, and so it's really a great honor for me. And thank you. I thank all of you once more.
Thank you, madam.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And we will look forward to many more exchanges like this. And when things are normal, we would want that you should come to the center and we would meet face and have interaction face to face. We have
Yeah,
to learn a lot from you. Thank
that would
thank
be
you very
lovely. Thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much. I would love to go over. Thank you so much. Yes. And I also, this is a, and we, as you said, we are really going through bad times, very grim time. I wish all of you a very, very healthy period ahead, you and all your relatives, friends, and to those who are not well, I wish them speedy recovery. So, all best wishes for the future.
Okay. Thank you, madam. And same from this side to your family and your near and dear ones. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you,
Thank
Jatin sir, for being here. And so we will. So we had indeed a very inspirational talk, and like many translation research scholars might have who had joined might have taken down wonderful notes from here and extend that to their own personal work. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. I take
you
leave
so
now.
much.
Thank you. We will be in touch, madam.
Yes,
We
we'll
will
be
be
in
in
touch.
touch.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
ఇంటికి ఓఆర్ఎస్ పీదే ଝାଡା ଏମିତି ହେଲା ମାନେ ଓଆରଏସ୍ ସାଙ୍ଗେ ସାଙ୍ଗେ ପିଇଦେବୁ ନହେଲେ ଦେହ କଣ ହେଇଯିବ। ଆଉ ଝରକା ଫରକା ଖୋଲିଦେ ଇଭିନିଂ ହେଲା ମାନେ ଝରକା ଖୋଲ ମାନେ ସଫୋକେସନ ତା ଭିତରେ ତ ଦେହ ବେଶୀ ଖରାପ ହେଇଯିବ। ଆଁ କଣ ଆଚ୍ଛା ଷ୍ଟିମ୍ କଲୁ କିନ୍ତୁ ମୁଁ କହୁଛି ଝରକା ଦି ସାଇଡରେ ଖୋଲିଦେ ସଫୋକେସନ ହେଇଯିବ ନହେଲେ।
अरे किए मोर स्टमक इन्फेक्शन एंड काई चेक करूनाहांती मोर काली भी बांति हेतला